Hello, everyone. Welcome to this workshop titled Adapting Your Data for Non-Scientists and Policymakers. My name is Meredith Schmale, and I'm the chair of NSPN's Public Engagement and Communications Committee, which is the group that is putting on this workshop. This is part of a larger series called our Science Communication Series. So if you're interested in this topic or other science communication related topics, we'd encourage you to look out for future events in this series as well. Before we start, we just have a couple of announcements. First, you might have gotten a notification when you first joined this meeting that it's being live streamed. Just to fully clarify, that's not an actual live stream. That's just the language that our transcription software uses to let us know that there's a current transcript being generated. So if you would like to use live captions, you can go ahead and click on that otter.ai icon in the top left of your screen, and you'll be able to open up the live transcript. Additionally, if you're able and comfortable turning on your camera, that's going to help facilitate more interaction, so we would love to see your faces. I just have a few announcements about some upcoming events and opportunities that you might be interested in. First of all, many of you are probably aware that the AAAS annual meeting is currently or is about to start as of tomorrow. So if you're interested, there's a link in the chat. You can still register, and there is a free version this year. It's completely online. So highly encourage you to check that out and learn more about science communication and science policy. If you're interested in the paid versions of this conference or other similar conferences, you might not be aware that NSPN actually provides funding opportunities that you can use to register for conferences or for other professional development needs. So we offer funding for individuals, for our NSPN chapters, and even external partner organizations. And we highly encourage you to check that out on our website as well. And finally, if you're interested in science diplomacy, there's an opportunity coming up next week on Thursday, February 24th. This will be a showcase for our SciDeal program, which stands for Science Diplomacy Exchange and Learning. This is a program that launched last year at NSPN, where groups are working with organizations all around the world that are doing science diplomacy work. So if you're interested in hearing about the inaugural cohort and the projects that they were working on, you can join the showcase next week and also network with the participants. So without further ado, I will now introduce the speaker for our workshop today. Steven Geofrey is a research practitioner in data, design, and computation, whose work is heavily informed by his interdisciplinary background in the natural sciences, specifically biophysics, and humanities, specifically Japanese studies. Through his practice, Steven explores themes of representation and narrative, seeking to respond to one question in particular. What does it mean to interrogate visualization as a medium for deconstructing privileged, canonical, and dominant perspectives? To examine this, Steven's work focuses primarily on the study of texts, where a text is anything that is situated, composed, and interpreted in systems of meaning making. Steven received an MS in molecular biophysics and biochemistry from Yale University in 2013, as well as a BA in chemistry and Asian studies from St. Olaf College in 2011. So I think Steven really brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to us today, and I'm excited to hear more about what he has to say. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steven to get us started with the workshop.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's always really a pleasure to talk with scientific audiences about data visualization, information design, and everything in between, because my background is originally in biophysics, and sort of through a long non-linear process, I moved away from the sciences and now do work in design, specifically in communicating and designing for information. And something that I appreciate a lot about speaking with scientific audiences is really the rigor with which the sciences sort of interrogates the practice of design. So I think there are tons of opportunities to really think about design in these really sort of rigorous, practical, and meaningful ways, and really situate that back in the practice of science. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I just want to start off by giving us a sense of what the plan is for our time together. So I'm going to start out by doing a bit of a lecture. I'm going to give sort of a whirlwind tour of a bunch of information design principles. And these will be principles that can sort of be the cornerstones of thinking about design in the context of scientific data and communicating those data to non-scientific audiences. After that, we'll have sort of a breakout workshop activity where it'll be broken out into groups, and you'll have the opportunity to critique a figure or a visualization that maybe you have made yourself with other members of a group, and then proceed from there to talk about how you would redesign that figure for different kinds of audiences. And I'm going to ask you to do that by really sort of thinking in terms of the kinds of design principles that I'm going to introduce before we get to that point. And then at the end of our time together, I'll sort of synthesize our work together, offer some additional resources for tools, learning materials, things like that. And hopefully you will walk away with some really concrete takeaways that help you think about your own practice of design in your own scientific work. So I want to start this session with a provocation, and that provocation is what you see on the screen here. So designing for information means designing the visual, spatial, and temporal dimensions of your reader's attention. So a lot of the time when we think about design in the context of, for example, a data visualization, we spend a lot of our time thinking about the visual design of that figure, of that chart. But it's important to remember that the experience of a figure, of a data visualization, is something that is situated in a particular space and in a particular time. And that's especially true when we're working with different kinds of audiences who may come to our figures in different spaces, in different times. So I want us to think about sort of what it means to design for information across all these dimensions that are beyond purely what's appearing on the screen in front of us. So there are three key dimensions or areas I want to focus on. The first is composition. I'll talk about balancing and aligning content and why that matters. Move from there into talking about hierarchy. So using color and composition for wayfinding through complex data. And then finally, I'll end with some ideas around storytelling, looking at microscopic, mesoscopic, and macroscopic levels of a narrative we want to try and communicate about a data set. So I'm going to start by talking about composition, because composition refers to sort of the global overall arrangement of content in a figure, in a graphic, and how that content is distributed across the available space and the available time. So you don't always think about the time piece, but I'm going to argue that time is something that is tangled up in how something is distributed over space. So I want to talk about three key compositional techniques: white space, alignment and justification, and then finally exploiting these things called Gestalt principles. So I'm going to start by talking about white space, and I want to talk about this by presenting an example of a figure, in this case an infographic, that uses white space very cleverly, but in ways that we may not be immediately aware of. So this is an infographic that presents a bunch of different views, different visualizations, different slices of data about the prevalence of HIV diagnoses throughout the country. And there's a lot of information that's densely packed into this infographic, but the density is offset by the way in which all the content is arranged. So here I've drawn a gray rectangle across every major block of text, every major block of a graphic or a visualization. And as you look at this presentation here, I want you to notice the white space. So the amount of space that is in between the gray blocks of actual content. Because the purpose of the white space here is to lead the gaze of your eyes. So it's not only that the content is distributed across this space, but there's sort of an implied order of reading that's built into the way that this composition uses white space. So there are certain places where there's less white space between chunks of content. There are certain places where there's a little bit more white space between chunks of content, and that's very intentional. because our brain is able to pick up on those nuanced differences and infer an order that we're expected to read through the content. And that's especially important here because, again, there's a lot of information here. And without it being overwhelming, we're giving sort of these unconscious cues of where to read next, the order in which to look at the information. Here's another example that also does some clever work in exploiting white space. This is an infographic about fishery industry. And if I do the same thing where I put gray blocks across the major chunks of content, something to notice in this example here is that, again, there's a lot of information. It's very densely packed, but all of the information has been neatly and cleanly separated from all the other chunks of information. And the way that's working here is that there are so many different scales of content, right? So some of these gray boxes are bigger, some of them are smaller, but all of these different scales of content are related to one another, specifically by consistent ratios in terms of their sizes, their relative sizes, and in the way that they've been organized in a grid. So both of these examples, both of these infographics, they rely on grids to help organize and guide our attention through densely packed information. The difference is that the fish infographic uses an explicit grid where there are clear lines we can actually see, whereas the HIV example uses an implicit grid, and that grid space is sort of organized using white space. So the thing we don't immediately pay attention to, but our brain is doing something to interpret what that white space means in terms of an implicit grid behind the content. So grids in general are a tremendously helpful strategy for organizing content. And the reason why they're so helpful is because they help distribute and balance content. And this is especially relevant in the context of a graphic or a figure, such as a scientific figure, where the two primary types of content we're working with are images, for example, maybe a visualization, and text, some text that explains or describes the visualization. So we can use grids to balance these two different kinds of content. Now, there are a variety of ways that we can do this balancing. I have three highlighted here of particular interest. So one way we can balance content is by leveling the cadence of text and image in the order in which they're read. So thinking back to that example, the HIV infographic example, where there was an implicit ordering in which we're supposed to follow the content across the infographic. In that ordering, there's sort of an even cadence or a mixed up cadence of text, graphic, so on and so forth. So this is something that our brain picks up on in terms of the intensity with which we have to focus on different kinds of content. So leveling that cadence can do a lot to improve the experience of our reader. Another thing we can do to balance content is to distribute content blocks evenly across available space, as we've seen with the previous examples. And then lastly, we can also exploit axes of symmetry and alignment whenever that's possible. So a very easy way to think about doing this in any kind of graphic is to think about the available space that you can work with, and then subdivide that available space, such as the space available on a page of an academic journal article, and subdivide that space into segments that, again, are related to one another by consistent ratios. And the consistent ratios piece is really an important piece. Think about dividing something into fourths, or dividing something into halves and then dividing one and a half into another half. Again, these are simple, consistent ratios, and that's really a good baseline way of thinking about how to organize and balance content. When we subdivide space in this way, what we're really doing is distributing the negative space. So again, going back to that example of white space and how that guides our attention, right? When we subdivide the space to balance some content, we're really sort of manipulating where we're putting the negative space. And the purpose of the negative space is to give a visual anchor point that makes the overall layout just generally more perceptible. Here are a couple of examples that do this, but in a slightly different strategy. So in these two examples, I want you to notice that both of them use and exploit a very prominent vertical axis of alignment, right? So there's a graphic on the right half of the page and explanatory text on the left half of the page. And this is a very simple way of, again, balancing the fact that there's a lot of dense text stuff and a lot of dense graphic stuff, but doing that in a layout that is very easy to perceive, right down the middle of that central axis of alignment. You can do that horizontally as well. Now, the reason why these things like white space, alignment, and grids work so well, and they're so easy to implement in terms of improving composition, is because of something our brain does when looking at the visual arrangement of stuff on a page. And the things that explain, at least partially, what our brains do to organize visual stuff are these things called Gestalt Principles of perceptual organization. Now, these are principles that explain or rationalize how human perception tends to group content together into digestible chunks. So if there's a lot of complex stuff appearing on a page, our brain has to do some work to figure out how to order and make sense of all of that stuff. And so these Gestalt principles offer one way to think about how that arrangement happens. Now there's several different Gestalt principles. The two I want to focus on, because these are most relevant in the context of something like a data visualization, are the principles of proximity and similarity. These are especially influential and strong in sort of dictating how we perceive information. These have a strong effect on the way that content is grouped in terms of how someone perceives or reads a figure or a visualization. So the proximity rule says that objects that are close together are grouped together as being part of a single unit. The principle of similarity says that objects that look alike get grouped together as a single unit. And both of these things are something that we can exploit to make a figure easier to understand and just more digestible from a perceptual perspective. So a simple way to do this exploitation is to, first of all, use easily perceptible baselines. So aligning contents, it's not just something that looks nice, it's something that's rooted in psychology and the psychology of design. So if you have different chunks of content, you should be able to draw straight lines that connect those chunks of content. And those could be all sort of aligned against each other. There could be a vertical or a horizontal central axis of alignment, as we saw with the infographics a couple of slides ago. Doesn't matter where it is, but there should be a logical and perceptible visual spatial relationship between the content in your graphic. Another thing we can do is to provide sufficient padding between elements. So this goes back again to that use of white space. The quantity of white space between chunks of content can literally make or break our brain's ability to perceive that content as being part of a group. And so that's going to depend on the kind of figure that you're trying to create. Sometimes you might accidentally put too little space between chunks of content that will give the impression that that content is directly related to each other when it shouldn't be. Sometimes we'll accidentally put too much space between chunks of content, which gives our brain the impression that those things are not related at all, but maybe they should be. So there's sort of a perfect sweet spot of amount of white space in between chunks of content, and that's really going to depend on the overall design. So it's just something to be aware of and to consciously think about as something that can have a really significant effect on the quality of a figure. Now, all of these things around composition are important, not only in terms of arranging the stuff in a figure, but they relate to something that is sort of a higher level consideration we should always keep in mind. And that higher level consideration is something called hierarchy. Hierarchy in the design of a figure refers to the levels of structure that organize the content in that graphic or figure and guide the viewer's attention through that content. So we can think about hierarchy as a way of facilitating wayfinding through a figure. So we don't often think about wayfinding in the context of a graphic, but it's so important because wayfinding is the way in which our readers are able to make sense of our information, our data, no matter how complicated or dense it might be. So the purpose of this wayfinding is to provide guideposts and really tell the reader where should their eyes go next. And this is especially important when working with very complex topics and data sets. So composition is one way to build in hierarchy. I'm going to talk about another way of building in hierarchy, which is through color. And color is one of the easiest ways to really instantly improve the quality of a figure. It's also one of the easiest ways to make the quality of a figure worse if we're not paying attention to what we're doing. So I want to focus on using color specifically to build in opportunities for wayfinding by providing regions of contrast. Regions of signaling, this is where the reader's eye should go next. So here's an example that uses color for sort of this wayfinding signaling purpose. This is a heat map visualization that shows changes in average temperature over time, over several years in Tokyo, Japan, for the summer months. And in this particular visualization, this diverging color palette is used to really highlight the higher end extreme temperature values, that dark red in the middle of the figure, because there's so much data here, right? There are so many individual cells in this heat map, and certainly someone could get easily lost in looking at every single one by one, but that's not the purpose of this visualization. The purpose is to draw the reader's attention to the angry red region of the heat map. And so the use of color here is intentional to really draw that attention immediately right away. Here's another example that uses color for wayfinding, but in a slightly simpler way. So color can be an important part of typography as well. So when I talk about typography, I'm referring to essentially the text that appears in a figure or a graphic. In this example here, there's a direct one-to-one correspondence between the color of the text annotations, the word labels outside the figure, and the lines inside the figure, right? So the purple text corresponds to the purple line, the green text corresponds to the green line, so on and so forth. And the purpose of color here is to provide that connection between the graphic itself and also these text annotations that provide more information about what's going on inside the graphic. So we can use color as a way of annotating, and annotation allows us to provide guideposts for wayfinding. All of these things kind of cycle with each other. So I have 3 general tips for using color effectively and appropriately in a figure. The first is to use colors in a figure that are easy to distinguish. And this might seem obvious, like common sense. However, a lot of the time when we create, for example, a visualization, we'll be creating these visualizations with a piece of software that might make choices for us about applying a color palette. And sometimes we will trust our software a little bit more than we should. And out the other end, we get a visualization that is actually not readable. It's not legible because of a poor choice of color palette. So an example of where this often goes wrong is in situations where we're trying to interpolate a small range of colors to a large number of data classes. So in this slide, at the top of the slide, there's a 4-color palette. And this 4-color palette is fairly easy to distinguish. There's some variation in lightness in the greens. And then there's sort of the yellow, the bright yellow at the other end. And in the 4-color palette, this doesn't cause too many problems. If we take this same color palette and try to extend it out to 10 colors, for example, corresponding to 10 different data classes, we're going to run into a lot of problems. Because now, all of a sudden, the stepwise differences between any pair of colors is not easily perceptible. And this is the kind of thing that can happen without us even noticing it. For example, when using software to create a visualization. So this very simple thing just to be aware of, just being conscious of the fact that this can happen is a great first step to making figures more readable in the first place. In general, in figures, use a total of 4 to 6 different colors. That's really ideal. You never really want to go more than 12 different colors because by that point, the diminishing returns on human perception far outweigh sort of the perceived advantages of representing more data in a figure. If you have too many colors, then the best choice of action is to transform your data to reduce the total number of data classes. So in general, less is better when it comes to color. It's so much less is better that a good sort of rule of thumb when designing a figure is to start by choosing only 2 colors. One color should be the primary color used for the primary ink-based portions of a figure, such as a line drawing or axes or points in a figure. And the other color should be an accent color. And the purpose of an accent color is to be an accent, which means it should be used sparingly. And specifically, only for situations when you want to draw attention to specific places in a figure. So here's an example that does this really effectively. So this is another infographic. Notice that the majority of the graphic is gray. So the coloring of the human in this graphic is gray. And the places where we want to pay attention to are highlighted in purple for the brain, and this bright yellow for these places of annotation. Notice how sparingly color is used in this figure. And in the places where color is specifically being used, it's used very intentionally to draw attention. So this rule of thumb can be used to really effective ends when designing a figure. So something to sort of challenge yourself on is to use this as a starting point for any kind of visualization or graphic you might create. Of course, it's just a starting point. You can, of course, use more colors in a figure, but it's a good challenge to think about, can I actually communicate what I want to communicate with just 2 or even 3 colors? That's always a good question to ask ourselves. So another good strategy for choosing appropriate color palettes is to use colors that are accessible. And in a lot of situations, when we talk about accessibility, we're talking in terms of accessible design. So for example, in the case of colors, dealing with things like color blindness. So for example, on this slide, the left color palette, sort of this rainbow color palette, I have one of these columns of colors highlighted. And notice what happens when someone with color blindness tries to perceive that exact same palette. So in the full color version, we have green and orange, which might represent two different data classes. For example, nominal data classes or categorical data classes in a visualization. But now in color blindness, that nominal or categorical distinction is lost entirely. And in its place, we have what appears to be a single hue sequential color palette, which will have implications for how the figure is then interpreted and understood. And of course, when we can only present our figures in terms of grayscale, colors are lost entirely. So this happens, for example, when we need to print a figure, or maybe we're working with a journal that will not allow for a color figure, right? So obviously in those kinds of situations, we have to be prepared for the possibility that a key part of our graphic cannot be communicated if that color is lost entirely. So to use colors that are accessible, a good idea is to use colors with strong visual contrast and also with strong legibility. These two things don't always go hand in hand. So for example, on this slide here, on the left side of the screen, we have examples of color pairings that have strong contrast and are highly legible, where on the right side of the screen, we have colors with strong contrast, but poor legibility. And so it's not enough just to choose colors that contrast strongly, but more importantly, use some common sense of if the thing is painful to read, then probably you should choose a different color palette. Another thing you can do when choosing colors is to choose colors that vary mainly in brightness, as opposed to differences in hue. And by hue, I mean like the name of a color, like red, green, blue. And the reason why choosing colors that vary mainly in brightness is helpful is because our eyes are very sensitive to changes in brightness, less sensitive to changes in hue. And so if you're working with, for example, a figure where you need to represent something in terms of color, maybe if you're working with a continuous quantitative variable, maybe it's a good idea to really exaggerate differences in brightness in your color palettes, just to make it crystal clear what the different data classes in your visualization represent. And of course, lastly, if you don't need to encode data through color, then don't use color at all. Really, color should be used very deliberately and very intentionally, and never be something that's just thrown in purely for aesthetic reasons, unless you know exactly why you're using it for that reason. All right, so last tip here is to use colors that communicate meaning. There are three major classes or types of color palettes. There's a sequential color palette in which we have a single hue that is extended in one direction with changes in lightness or brightness. There's a diverging color palette, which typically uses two hues that extend in opposing directions with varying changes in lightness. And then there's a qualitative color palette, which uses different hues altogether. No differences or meaningful differences in brightness or lightness. And all of these different types of color palettes are good for specific kinds of data because they semantically communicate what the data can communicate. So for example, a sequential and a diverging color palettes are good for numeric data, continuous quantitative data. A sequential color palette can be useful for an ordinal variable where there are implied rank orders between data classes. And a qualitative data color palette is good for categorical or nominal data. Now, again, when it comes to color palettes, software isn't often on our side because software will give us a whole bunch of options for different color palettes and often leave it up to us to decide which one looks the nicest. But again, software doesn't always make the right choices for choosing the appropriate color palette type based on the kind of data being encoded. So a common mistake in designing figures with color is to use a qualitative color palette that has changes in lightness to encode a nominal variable. So the reason why this is problematic is that a nominal variable, there are no rank order relationships between classes of a nominal variable. But in a color palette like the one you see on the screen here, and exaggerated even further on this screen, right? So in this color palette, we have different hues, for example, blue, orange, green, purple, and gray. And by themselves, the hues could represent different nominal categorical data classes. However, the problem is that each of these hues is also extended as its own mini sequential color palette. And a sequential color palette implies rank order. And so all of a sudden, our variable, which should be nominal, is being communicated as though there are ordinal relationships between the data classes. And that is something that gets confused and tangled up in sort of how our brains are interpreting the relationships between colors. So using the appropriate type of color palette is really important in this context. Now, another big problem that we run into in terms of choosing semantically appropriate color palettes is something that happens with specifically rainbow color palettes. So you may have heard before that using a rainbow color palette is not a good idea. You may not know why it's not a good idea. Well, here's an example that demonstrates why this is problematic. So here's a visualization. It's a map, a choropleth map of the United States. And each county in the map is filled with a color. And I've intentionally left out the color legend here, because if you look at this visualization, first without looking at the color legends, the first thing you might notice is that there's a whole lot of yellow on the left side of the country, and there's a whole lot of blue on the right side of the country. And there appears to be sort of this very stark divide between East and West. And that stark divide is coming from the perceptual effect of our eyes perceive the division between green and yellow to be very intense, more intense than any other place in the color spectrum. Now, the problem with this is that immediately our brain infers stark divide between left and right. However, if we put the color key back in, this apparent sharp divide doesn't actually encode a sharp divide. So specifically, the step in color from one color to the next in this color palette is exactly equal in size in the step of data values between those colors. So in this case, the different colors represent quantized values of tenths of values. But the problem here is that because of the way our brain interprets different colors across the entire color spectrum, not each of these steps in color is inferred as encoding the exact same step in data value. So another thing just to be aware of is that these choices with things like color are tangled up in the way that we perceive color and the way that our brains interpret the meaning of color. Now, the last sort of set of strategies I want to talk about before we sort of jump into our workshop session here is this idea of storytelling with data. In the end, whenever we are communicating data, we're trying to tell some sort of story about those data. And how we design a figure is tightly intertwined with the stories we want to tell about those data. So in any kind of visualization, there are 5 key types of storytelling devices that are embedded into the way that a figure is designed. So those key storytelling devices are showing changes of something over time, interesting factoids or things you want to draw attention to as being outliers, surprising connections or relationships between different data points, appealing to personal experiences, and then lastly, revealing comparisons between data classes. And every basic kind of visualization is sort of an exemplification of these different kinds of storytelling devices. So a bar chart is great for revealing comparisons. A line chart is great for showing changes over time. Scatter plots, great for showing surprising connections between variables. A pie chart for revealing comparisons as well. A choropleth map is great for personal experiences, sort of situating the experience of a data set in someone's experience of geographic space. And then a node link diagram or a network graph is great for showing surprising connections as well. So all of these storytelling devices, again, are embedded in the design of a figure. One way to think about how to design a figure to really highlight the specific storytelling device you want to highlight is to represent your data through different scales of view, moving sort of in and out at different levels of zoom to relate the data in a figure to parts of your readers or your audience's experience or relationship to the topic of those data. So here's an example that does this really effectively. This is from a New York Times article in 2019 that was sort of an investigation into climate change trends at the time, 2019. And what this example does really expertly is it takes this really complicated and complex data sets and complex topic of climate change and guides the reader through that complexity by providing many different scales of perspective. So in this visualization, in this article, we have sort of an overall visualization that provides a geographic view of the data. So places across the world with different changes in warming patterns, 2019 compared to the middle of the 20th century. So providing sort of this global geographic view. And then it moves from there into providing sort of this temporal view. So looking at the data for 2019 as it relates to the last history of 200 years. After that, it takes both these geographic and temporal views and tries to integrate them, integrating both a short and a long view of both time as well as geographic space. So here we have all of these small multiple copies of that initial visualization, but now for each year across the data set. And then lastly, this article proceeds to make the data behind the story tangible through the use of photographs, right? Photographs that relate to the actual lived experience of people who are experiencing the effects of climate change. So all of these different levels of perspective are essential to this idea of storytelling with our data sets and guiding our reader through the complexity of a topic that we might be expert in, but that our readers may not be. So I have a few simple techniques for structuring a figure or a visualization through this storytelling kind of lens. Those include small multiples, context and focus, and then micro, meso, and macroscopic views. So I start by talking about small multiples. So a small multiple approach involves taking a single visualization and repeating that exact same visualization multiple times, such as across multiple time snapshots or multiple geographic space snapshots. So here's an example of small multiples where we have a choropleth map of average ozone air quality index across 3 different years, 2000, 2005, and 2010. And it's the exact same visualization, choropleth map, with the exact same color scale, but the data are changing across them. So the purpose of a small multiple visualization is to juxtapose the same visualization type across multiple slices of the data set so that we can enable comparisons across time and space. Another great strategy is to use something called context and focus. So context refers to providing a global overall view of data in a visualization. And then focus refers to really drawing attention to a specific place in that figure that allows the reader to zoom in to a particular data point or a particular collection of data points without losing the overall view of the data set as a whole. So here's an example that does this very effectively using color. This is a visualization showing changes in ozone air quality index over time. And notice that most of the figure is gray. However, the real place where color pops out is this region that's orange. So all of these orange dots represent dates in which the air quality index was considered unhealthy for sensitive groups. And so immediately that color is really providing the focus of the figure, but at the same time, we haven't lost the context of the entire data set as a whole. So we can use color to achieve that. Here's an example that uses context and focus in a slightly different way. This is a collection or sequence of figures that talks about the prevalence of lung cancer. And the way that this uses context and focus is by providing different slices of viewpoints into the data set. So these 5 different panels, each panel represents a similar visualization, but a different slice of a data set of interest. And by providing these different views in sequence, the reader is presented first the overall context for the data sets, and then by the end, really zoomed in and focused on the key point of interest and attention in the data set. Lastly, you can also use a figure to build in multiple levels of zoom directly into the design of the figure, namely at a macroscopic or a global view, a microscopic or a very small zoomed in view, and then finally a mesoscopic view in between the macro and the micro. And the purpose of this is to give the reader opportunities to move in and out across different zoom levels of a figure, of a topic, of something you're trying to communicate. So this infographic demonstrates one way of doing this. So the overall view of this infographic is of an airport. So that's sort of the macroscopic view. Way at the microscopic view, we have these little figures that refer to individuals and their experiences in the airport. And then the mesoscopic view is something that's sort of negotiated between that macro and that micro. And it really invites the user to sort of move in and out across these different levels of zoom. And that moving in and out makes the figure feel more dynamic And if you can make a figure feel more dynamic, that's the kind of thing that will sustain the attention of your audience for much longer times. So in all of these different strategies, right, it's really important to remember that you are the expert of your own research, but your audience might not be. And so it's really our responsibility as the experts to think very carefully about the design of how and what we are communicating, what we are trying to communicate. And so using storytelling devices to frame the design of a figure, using composition and hierarchy to build in guideposts for wayfinding into figure, all of these things are strategies that can very easily improve the quality of a figure with very instant results. So again, just a whirlwind view of some things to think about with information design. There's a lot that we can learn in terms of strategies in the world of design. These are sort of just entry points for thinking about where to start critiquing a particular visualization or figure. So I'd like to move into a little activity where I'm going to give you the opportunity to critique and redesign a figure of your own. Before I jump into that, are there any questions I can answer about anything I just talked about? There's one question in the chat I'll respond to. There's a question that asks, how would you differentiate between brightness and hue? So when I refer to hue, I'm talking about differences in named colors like red, green, blue, etc. When I'm talking about brightness, brightness refers to the quantity of white inside of a single color hue. So we can have a sequential color palette, for example, where it's all just one hue, for example, all red, but different brightnesses of red. So very dark red to a very light, maybe pinkish red, and everything in between. And it's that movement across brightnesses or lightnesses that I mentioned is very easy for human eyes to perceive. A little bit more easily than changes or differences in colors. And the reason for that is because one of the problems with looking at differences between color hues is that there are two layers of translation that have to happen. It's not always immediately obvious how to compare a red and a green to each other in terms of the relative brightness or darkness of them. Right, so it's kind of hard to sort of make those relationship connections across different data classes if you're trying to encode, for example, a categorical or qualitative data class that should be represented as a continuous color palette. So all of these sort of depend on what exactly you're trying to imply in terms of the relationships between different data classes. Are there any other questions I can answer at this moment?
Hi, I do have one question with relation to the ratio of white space versus content. Is there an optimal ratio for just a conventional poster in comparison to PowerPoint slide? Like, do you have a, like specifically, like sometimes I get confused of like, should I put more white space on the left and right compared to the top and bottom? Do you have any insights on that?
So what I would suggest about that is those kinds of questions depend also on the context and environment in which the thing will be read. So for example, with a poster, so think about how people typically experience a poster at an academic conference, scientific conference, right? So you have this giant piece of paper, and you may be in sort of this giant hall with a bunch of easels set up with a bunch of other posters. And your goal is to get someone's attention from far enough away that they'll want to walk up and look at your poster and engage with you about your research. Now, in that kind of situation, depending on the environment in which the poster is being presented, it may be a good idea to increase the amount of white space around the edges of the poster paper, just so that you can really visually distinguish your content of your poster from the surrounding environment. And so the same thing is true with, for example, a PowerPoint presentation, right? So that will depend on the environment in which someone might be reading some slides, which could be on a projector in a conference room, could be on a laptop screen. So my suggestion would be to think about what context makes the most sense for who will be reading your stuff, and then sort of design primarily for that context.
Thank you.
So there's one more question in the chat here. So I'll respond to this question, and then I'm going to have us jump into our activity. So the question is, would there be any differences in using design thinking approaches to storytelling vis-a-vis policymakers and the lay public, both non-scientists, of course? I don't, so my opinion is that there aren't fundamental differences in how you use design thinking in either of these contexts. So using design thinking to design a figure for a scientific audience versus design thinking to design for a non-scientific audience. Because in both situations, we're designing. And the purpose of our design might be slightly different in a scientific versus a non-scientific environment. But in the end, the purpose of design is to communicate. So the bigger question here is, how does the way you communicate to policymakers or the lay public differ from how you communicate to other scientists or other experts? And that's where all of these information design principles come into play, into really thinking about and rationalizing how and why we're communicating what we're trying to communicate. So it's very well possible that, for example, you create a figure, and for a scientific context, maybe that figure really relies on the storytelling device of interesting connections or revealing comparisons. But maybe if you need to refactor that figure for a policymaker or a policy environment where you need something to change in terms of policy, maybe the most important thing to highlight there is a change over time. Because maybe it's the change over time that a policymaker needs to see in order to be motivated to sort of pursue a particular change in policy. So again, all of these things require adapting. What is the ultimate goal of sharing a figure or a graphic with someone in the first place? And if you can identify that, then the rest of the process is still designing, is still employing design thinking, but now you're just sort of using and being a little bit more deliberate about which design strategies you actually implement to create that figure. So long story short, I would call all of these things a process of design thinking. All right, so what I'd like to do now is use the remaining time to give you an opportunity to practice thinking about composition, hierarchy, and storytelling with an actual figure. So you were asked to potentially bring a figure or a graphic that you have created yourself or that you have seen recently in the scientific literature or anywhere else. And I'm gonna break you off into small groups and ask you to choose one of those examples in your group. And first, do a critique of the figure as a group. Think about the design of the figure in terms of composition, hierarchy, and storytelling. And then after that, I'm going to ask you to do an exercise in redesigning that figure for a non-scientific audience of your choice. And think about how that figure would need to be redesigned in terms of composition, hierarchy, and storytelling devices, and then justify why that redesign makes sense. So a link has been shared in the chat. If you follow that link, I'm going to share my screen. If you follow that link, you will come to a Google Drive folder that looks like this. In this folder, you'll find a copy of slides, the ones I just presented. And you'll also find this Communicating Scientific Data Through Information Design, Google Slides breakout activity. Go ahead and open that up. Now, what's going to happen is on the first two slides, there are some instructions for what you're going to do. But we're going to break you out into small groups, and each group has 2 slides that have been created for you already, 2 template slides. And on the first slide for your group, I want you to choose a figure that someone in your group has brought, copy and paste it into this slide, and then perform a critique of that figure in terms of composition, hierarchy, and storytelling devices. Now, on the very first slide, I have a list of discussion questions you can use as a starting point for your critique in terms of looking at the composition or hierarchy and determining or deciding if it helps or hinders the readability of a figure. So you can use that as a starting point if you would like. But afterwards, once you're done, I want you to come up with at least 3 recommendations for how to improve the design of the figure in terms of composition, hierarchy, or storytelling. So a critique, a sort of deconstruction, followed by a series of recommendations. So spend about 10 to 15 minutes on that task. Don't take too much time with that, because then after that, each group has a second slide where you have the opportunity to redesign that figure for a non-scientific audience of your choice. Now, there are 2 slots on each slide for each group. You may not get done with 2. You probably will only get done with 1. That's fine. But sort of come up with a simple mock-up of how that redesign might look, and then summarize how and why you're redesigning that figure for that specific non-scientific audience, and justify the redesign choices that you end up making. So use the Google Slides as a way of documenting your conversation, and I will be jumping around from room to room and answering any questions you might have along the way. Are there any questions about what I'm asking you to do before I open the breakout rooms? Okay. So let's see here. I'm just going to do 3 breakout rooms, and that will give about 3 people per room, which is a good size. So I'm going to open the breakout rooms and assign you automatically, and you can join once they open. Welcome back. Sorry to abruptly pull you away from what sounded like very interesting conversations. So I moved from room to room, and I was hearing a lot of really great points, a lot of very common kinds of problems and questions that I feel like we encounter, especially in the context of scientific data and communication and figure design. So already thinking about the kinds of things that are related to composition, hierarchy, and storytelling. And just sort of as a way of wrapping up all of this is, I want to sort of reinforce this idea that when we design for any kind of audience, what we're doing is we're being very particular about what slices of our data we're presenting to different kinds of people, right? So if we think about our research as sort of this vast universe of galaxies and data points, right? The purpose of a figure which has very limited space is to articulate which regions of that universe you're currently pointing attention to. And sometimes you'll be pointing attention to the same region of that space, but from a different perspective, based on the particular audience that you're trying to communicate towards. So that's what design is all about. Design is an awareness that there's limited time and space to point attention to something. So how can we be very deliberate and intentional about how we use that time and space and the available canvas of a page, for example, to get our point across as effectively and cleanly and clearly as possible. So that's really the challenge of design. So I just want to stop by quickly showing a few resources you might find useful for doing more of this sort of thinking about design. These are at the end of that slide deck that you can download from Google Drive. First of all, there are tons of great tools for color palettes and choosing color. It's online. A really useful tool I would recommend is something called Color Brewer. This is a tool that was originally designed for cartography and map design. Color Brewer is distinct in that it presents something called perceptually uniform color palettes. A perceptually uniform color palette is a color palette in which the differences between colors are perceptually uniform in terms of changes in hue, in terms of changes in lightness, things like that. So it's a bunch of really, really effective color palettes you can just use out of the box. So it's a great tool. If you want more individual control over designing color palettes, Peloton is a great tool for creating collections of color palettes starting from a single color, maybe a primary theme color, for example. So those are two tools that I would highly recommend in particular for color. For more sort of general discussion of design in the context of scientific data, I highly, highly recommend this collection of points of view articles from Nature. This is a series entirely about data visualization and information design in the context of scientific data design. So this is a fantastic resource. Talks about Gestalt, composition, use of negative space, storytelling, all of these things. It goes into a bit more depth than I had time to do here today. For more general purpose learning about information design, books by Edward Tufte are a great resource. So in particular, the visual display of quantitative information in the middle there is sort of the gold standard for everything information design. So those are great resources. And then in terms of getting inspiration for creating figures and visualizations, the Tableau Public Visualization Gallery is a great place to get some inspiration and ideas of different ways to communicate different kinds of data sets. And then lastly, if you are interested in finding tools for sort of quick and dirty drawing of visualizations, this tool called Raw Graphs is something that will create SVG and PNG visualizations. So you like upload a data set in terms of a CSV file, choose encodings, control some slight parameters of the visualization, and then out comes a figure that you can download and potentially manipulate further in Adobe Illustrator, for example. So that's a tool for doing some sort of exploratory kind of visualization. Might also give you some more ideas of how to communicate data that way too. Lastly, thank you. Thanks for having me. If you have questions about data design, information visualization, feel free to reach out to me. So my email address is there. I'm happy to answer any questions at any point in the future. So don't hesitate to send me an email and say hello. With that said, that's all I have. So thank you so much. Thanks for hanging a little later than the end time. It's a pleasure to meet you all. And that's a wrap for me.
Thank you, everyone. If anyone has any questions, feel free to stay, but otherwise you are all free to go. Thanks.